Hi, I'm Erin Somerville going over interest groups. This is an introduction lecture. And I thought we would start off by looking at some of the most powerful interest groups that are out there. There's a lot of ways to come up with a list of powerful interest groups. This one here is a list that is gathered by members of Congress, senior White House aides, people that are influenced by those groups. So pause, take a minute to look at this and keep this in the back of your mind as we go through interest groups today. So I want us to take a look at this structure here, which we'll see a whole lot, the policymaking system. I'm going to show it throughout the unit over and over and over again, because in a picture it tells us what this course is about. And what you'll see is it begins and ends with the people, which is the hope for a democracy, that the people control the government and that their interests, problems, and concerns can determine the sorts of policies that a government would produce. So over here, way over to the right, is the government, the policymaking institutions. We have the legislative branch, which is composed of two chambers. We have the executive branch. We have the courts, and then the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is technically part of the executive, but as we'll discuss in this course, the bureaucracy could be thought of as a fourth branch, almost as powerful as the other three, although not referenced in the Constitution. And so the people, way over here, are trying to influence the government. And so how that formation from what are interests and concerns into policies, how it goes is first, people start to mobilize over various interests, problems, whatever is going on. And then they want to somehow communicate that to the government. And when we think about what can be done at any given time as far as civic society or politics, only so many topics can be covered at once. In a way, there's like a bandwidth that we all have in our own minds and a bandwidth that the government has. So only some of the issues will make it to the agenda, meaning it makes it to the forefront of our thinking as stakeholders. I will be using that term stakeholders a good amount. That's anyone who's got skin in this game. So the people are stakeholders in government officials are, the parties are. So anyone that's affected by policy and would have an interest in changing policy, we're all stakeholders. Okay, so what connects the people to setting the agenda and then hopefully the government through these institutions delivering policy are four linkage institutions. So you'll have to know what these are, and you have to know what linkage institution is. It is what it looks like. It's an institution, a channel that connects or links the people to the government. So political parties link the people. It's a way for people to go out and sort of mobilize in groups. Today, the two dominant parties are the Democratic and Republican parties. But by identifying yourself with a party and the party developing a platform, a set of beliefs or promises, better term, a set of promises that they will deliver if elected, that helps better connect the over 300 million Americans to the government. Elections themselves, we get to turn out in November and vote, and that is a way to directly tell the government what we're happy with, what we're not happy with, what we want to see different. Interest groups are another linkage institution. They operate very differently from parties, and that's what this lecture is about. And finally, the media is another institution that connects us, the people, to the government, and also the government back to us. It very much has a two-way dynamic. All right, so the topics of the day, those vary, and not all important topics are on the agenda. So if our attention is really focused on judicial nominations or a crisis abroad, then that gets our attention. Lately, people have been very focused on reproductive rights. Is that the most important or only issue that Americans face? Not necessarily. I mean, we have a student loan crisis. That could be at the top. as far as affecting Americans very directly in their lives, but it doesn't necessarily make it to the agenda, meaning that it's not on the news. Politicians aren't making campaign promises about how they will reform student loan debt legislation. None of that's being talked about. So interest groups, our focus today, they are pretty good at setting the political agenda. They're able to get information out there that gets Americans mobilized or interested on their particular interest. And then if it's made it to the agenda, then it has the ears of the policymakers that work in these policymaking institutions, and they might deliver us policy. It might be through taxation, laws, regulations, court decisions, any of that. Then a policy is developed to us, is delivered to us, and it affects us. And then the cycle sort of restarts. Maybe an issue really was addressed and then it's no longer on the agenda, or maybe it's sort of changed and the issue hasn't gone away. So in 2010, the Affordable Care Act was passed, but has that fixed all of the problems that exist around health insurance in this country? Absolutely not. So the question is, in the upcoming elections, will that hit the agenda, and will that lead to actual changes and a change in policy that would then impact Americans? So this chart's going to be up a lot. Let's go over interest groups versus political parties. Interest groups, they are groups united on some particular agenda, but unlike political parties, they're not nominating candidates. So no one is running from the NRA to serve in an office. They have an issue. Sometimes it's a broad issue like labor rights, and then other times it's a more specific issue like reproductive rights. So interest groups specialize, whereas the parties tend to generalize. They tend to, in order to get a broader base of voters, they're going to generalize their policies. And interest groups, they don't want to hold office, but they certainly want to influence those who hold office. When we talk about interest groups, the people that they hire to go influence our elected officials are called lobbyists. And they got that name because people used to wait in the lobby for congressmen to come out so they could get their ear and influence them, inform them on important legislation or whatever's coming up. Today, lobbyists have a lot of offices on K Street. So sometimes you'll hear about K Street. When you hear K Street, we're talking about the powerful interest groups that have lobbyists working on K Street in DC. Interest groups fulfill a whole lot of functions. They definitely stimulate interest if they're able to, get ads and issue ads on television or on billboards. They represent the members of their group. So that might be a large membership. It might be a small membership. We'll talk about how the size of membership in an interest group varies. They provide specialized information. Because they focus on one interest, they've probably gathered a lot of data that might be interesting to Congress or to the court at some other time. They are another way for you to get politically involved. You might not necessarily feel very close an affiliation with the Democratic or Republican parties, but if you have an issue you're passionate about, there's probably an interest group that you can join or donate to or get involved with. They provide extra checks and balances because they are players in our politics. They are looking out for various interests, the interests that they serve, and by competing with one another in the public arena, that competition hopefully yields a good system of checks and balances in which no one interest group becomes too powerful. But that is debatable, and we'll talk about that as well. All right, I have some types of interest groups, although I don't think you'll need to really categorize them. So I just have some up here. I think what I'd want you to know for our discussion is thinking about broader groups than what I have here. I would think about consumer groups and producer groups broadly, and then probably civil rights and civil liberties groups as well. An example of a business group would be the Chamber of Congress. Labor groups would be AFL-CIO, agricultural groups, the National Farmers Union, Professional groups, the American Medical Association. Promoting causes, the ACLU, that's the American Civil Liberties Union. Welfare for certain groups like the NAACP. Religious groups like the National Council of Churches. And then other public interest groups that are usually caring about consumer rights. Okay, so this has a lot more meat to it. Interest groups can affect policy in all three branches. So if you're a lobbyist, there's a lot of doors for you to knock on. Congress is probably the most commonly thought of place for lobbyists to go to influence policy. It is also the beginning of the lawmaking process. So they can take a congressman out to lunch, tell them why they should vote a certain way on a bill or how a bill will affect their constituents positively or negatively. They can donate to campaigns of like-minded congressmen. And then sometimes if that interest group has a lot of important information, like data that they've collected about their particular interest, they might even be called to testify at a congressional hearing that is looking at some legislation. So if Congress is looking at an agricultural bill that, deals with dairy subsidies, they might need extra information that the National Farmers Union could provide them in trying to sort out legislation and figure out revisions and amendments that would be appropriate. Caution. Congressmen can be taken out to dinner. They can be sort of wined and dined by interest groups, and that might affect congressmen's decision making. Is that bribery? It's very close to it, if not it. But I want to caution you to assuming that any congressman's vote can be bought. I think what's more likely is that there are interest groups that look for already somewhat like-minded folks in Congress that can be influenced. And they would make sure that those folks get reelected with campaign contributions. So before we assume you can find a congressman who is totally pro-choice and you think that some group's going to approach him and tell him to vote for policy that's pro-life, they're not going to just flip like that. But rather, you're going to get continued support from interest groups as a congressman if you continue to support that interest. Executive. It's a little bit harder to lobby the president. You really shouldn't have direct access. Not many people should have access to the president, but you might have access to his staff, his cabinet, maybe him. That is possible. It's not as common as being able to find a congressman. And then we haven't talked about the bureaucracy a whole lot. You're reading about that, but interest groups, lobbyists can meet with bureaucrats and talk to them about rules and regulations that the departments are making that will profoundly affect their interest. And then you have the courts. Now lobbying, you cannot lobby the Supreme Court, so the word lobbying doesn't make sense there. Amicus curiae means friend of the court, and very often people just call them amicus briefs. When the court is making a decision on a topic, they're often looking at the constitutionality of something, but they also have to know a lot of practical information relevant to the topic. So when the Supreme Court was looking at the Affordable Care Act and various parts of legislation looking at the constitutionality of it, they did call in the American Medical Association, they called in AARP, they called in a number of interest groups that could bring more information to the table that might help them in making their decision, or at least understanding the factors at play in the case that they were looking at. Another way that interest groups can get involved with the judicial branch is through litigation. So an interest group might have the money to pay the legal fees for somebody who's got a lawsuit, and that lawsuit might lead to a court ruling that affects that interest group. So we saw a lot of this in the 50s and 60s. The NAACP was an interest group that was able to help with litigation for a lot of individuals dealing with civil rights cases. So the courts are not as you wouldn't say that they're lobbied, but there are ways for interest groups to influence the court through their amicus briefs and through litigation. And then I have at the bottom a definition of PACs. We'll talk about those later, but when I was saying contributions, what I mean is that interest groups they form PACs that raise money from individuals and then distribute it to various candidates that interest group would support. Okay, so interest groups can lobby the three branches, and just like, I guess let's end this slide with, just like individuals have many points of access to the government, us stakeholders have many points of access. We saw this with Lilly Ledbetter and Goodyear in their story that led to the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. We saw that each of them were able to access different parts of the government. Interest groups have the same accessibility, and that comes from the Madisonian system in which we have a separation of powers. So by having these powers divided, that provides us and interest groups more points of access, which would be important in a democracy for the stakeholders, the voters, and our interests to have ways to affect change. Okay, so when we think about interest groups in our country and how they work, there's a few theories for how interest groups work. Sometimes people talk about this as different types of representative democracy. I prefer theory because I think there's a debate to be had. So the question is, how do interest groups function in our democracy, in our representative democracy? Do interest groups participate, or does our democracy, not about interest groups, does our democracy function like a participatory democracy? What that means is that a lot of people participate, that there is broad participation in political and civic society. We should probably strike that one down just by looking at our voter turnout rates, which are incredibly low. And then polling that asks citizens how they feel about their efficacy in the political process. So given that we have a low voter turnout, we have a lot of evidence that we don't have a participatory democracy. Could we? Yes. Do we? It's debatable. So that's one theory of representative democracy. When reading Federalist 10, we can kind of see what about our representative government, our republic, makes participatory democracy a bit challenging. Okay, the next theory, you could put a smiley face next to this one. This is a very optimistic theory. It's probably the theory that Madison would like best, that he would have hoped for our republic to be. And this theory is a bit outdated, popular in the 50s and 60s, and has lost a lot of support. So this theory says that the way interest groups work in our representative democracy works really well. That there are many groups, and those many groups provide us a key link. So by having many interest groups, many people then get representation in government because they're able to link us as a linkage institution to the government. It also says groups compete. It assumes groups play by the rules. And because they're competing and mostly playing by the rules, no one group dominates. And what you end up with is groups competing and sort of checking and balancing one another. And ultimately, there should be really good policy that comes out of it. Because if one interest group is pushing some policy, some legislation that would negatively affect the overall good, the common good of the country, well, then the other interest groups would compete and sort of weed that one out. It believes that if a group is weak in one area, then it can make up in another. So, for example, while business interest groups enjoy having a lot of funding, a lot of money, labor groups have the numbers, which when it comes to a democracy, numbers matter. So pluralist democracy thinks, yes, we have many interest groups, which we would want in a healthy democracy, because interest groups protect freedom of speech, they allow us to assemble, and they help us to organize so we can tell the government, those policymaking institutions, what we want. So this is a very optimistic look, because it says no one group has become too powerful. They all compete in such a healthy way that the only policy that can be developed when you have this many interest groups pressuring government is really good policy that would be generally good for most. So this one has fallen out, and there's two other theories that people have these days for how our democracy is doing. There's hyperpluralism, which also is called interest group liberalism, and elitism or elite democracy. These two are pretty similar. So I'm going to go on for a while about hyperpluralism. Hyperpluralism is the idea that there's too many groups. So with pluralism, there's a lot of groups. You want a lot of groups that compete with one another. Hyperpluralism is that there's so many groups. And then the interest group liberalism is about how the government has essentially just been deferring to the groups. There's so many groups, and the government just gives in to each one. What does this group want? Okay, you get it. What does this group want? You get it. What does this group want? You get it. And then you end up with really dysfunctional policy, like contradictory policy and regulations coming out. So this leads to essentially wastefulness. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple, maybe one or two examples. So we have an interest in making sure that teens don't smoke, don't use tobacco products. They're highly addictive, they're expensive, they're not good for you. So federal funding goes to grant programs and to all sorts of things to dissuade teens from smoking, to help keep teens from smoking tobacco. And then at the same time, there are subsidies, which is essentially money, that go to help tobacco growers. So the government, in its quest to keep people from smoking, spends money to prevent smoking, and then at the same time helps out tobacco growers. This is contradictory, dysfunctional policy. And so with hyperpluralism, the idea is all the groups are getting what they want, and that's not good. That's not them competing, that's them all winning, and largely at the cost of the common good. Let's see, one more example. No, okay, elite democracy. So elitism is the idea that the largest corporations, the powerful few, hold all the power in our democracy. That some small groups will win tiny battles, but when it comes to the really big decisions, it's the powerful large corporations that control policy. So you can see how they're a bit related, because there's a dysfunctional nature to it. But when you hear interest group liberalism or hyperpluralism, we're not talking about concerted efforts between interest groups. We're talking about the government deferring and trying to give everybody what they want. Whereas elitism is about concerted efforts among an elite group that control a lot of wealth and then end up with a lot of power in our democracy. So those are four theories for how our democracy functions. And then sometimes people use this terminology to describe various representative democracies and how they are functioning. Okay, so does money matter? What I have with this chart is you can see some of the biggest spenders, the groups that have spent the most money on lobbying from 1998 to 2007. And you can see at the top of the list, you have pharmaceuticals. And that is interesting. We will talk more about that in class if there is some time. But what I want you to see is money plays a role. But is it a determining factor in policy? That is really up for debate. Having the most money on a campaign doesn't necessarily mean you win the election. Can these companies or can these interest groups, through their money, entirely control the process? And they can control a lot of it, but there is still the voter at the end of the day. So this will be a topic for us to discuss and debate, but I thought that one might be interesting for you to look at some of the big spenders. Okay, group theory. So there is this theory out there by this economist Olson, and his theory is that small groups work better than large groups. And it's because ultimately of the free rider problem. So he says, if you want to look at the efficacy of a group, the power of a group, the smaller the group, the better, the more powerful it will be. And he says the problem is the free rider problem. But let me go back to like how this theory works. He says that you have a potential group and an actual group. So the potential group, that is going to be the group of people that would benefit from some policy. Okay, and then you have the actual group. Those are the people who are members of the interest group. So let's think about the AFL-CIO. The AFL-CIO represents labor. Lots of people are low-wage workers. Lots of people. Not all of them are members of the AFL-CIO. Not all of them pay dues in that. But if the AFL-CIO goes out and actually secures a higher minimum wage for all low-paid workers benefit, even though not all of them were members of that interest group. So the potential group is everyone who would benefit from the collective good that an interest group is fighting for. The actual group are the people who have like memberships and pay dues into it. In that situation, there are many people in the potential group who are making a rational choice to not join the actual group because they will benefit regardless. That is the free rider problem. For an interest group, the fact that some or many potential members don't join because they can benefit from the group's activities without joining. If you don't have to pay and you end up getting this collective good, why would you pay in? Why would you work hard as part of the actual group? So when you have a small group, then what happens is the potential group and the actual group are closer in size and you have fewer free riders. And then you can operate more powerfully and effectively. So the free rider problem is about how it is irrational. It is rational to sometimes do nothing and let somebody else do it because you can get the benefit anyways. While it might be rational for an individual, it's probably not good for actually getting a collective good from government. All right, so how do you negate this problem? One way to overcome it, AARP has totally mastered, and it's called selective benefits. So AARP is our exception to the rule. When I say small groups function better, that is true with this exception because AARP is the largest interest group as far as numbers. And if you become an AARP member, you get all these benefits. You get insurance, you get information, you get the cool magazine, travel discounts. There's a ton of reasons to become an AARP member. And you pay a little bit, you get all this information, and that is a very effective, large interest group. But they are mostly the exception to the rule, and the way they've become that exception is by offering their members selective benefits, and that helps limit the free rider problem. All right, let's start to summarize. Interest groups, they are trying to influence the legislative branch, the executive branch, the courts, and the bureaucracy. But they also influence public opinion. And by influencing public opinion, then the people hopefully also put pressure on their parties and their governmental institutions. And how they influence the public opinion is by getting the word out, spreading the message to the public through the press, building positive relationships, and by getting the public to adopt their views, by getting more people interested in their topic, that helps better set the agenda and hopefully make that change. They also use the political parties, although they don't run candidates. The parties exist, and they can fund campaigns. They can get issue ads that might affect the campaigns, and they can get support from one or both parties. They don't necessarily have to be, an interest group might be funding both Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and they might be getting good policy from those Republicans and Democrats working together. Single issue groups, those are the ones that have like a very specific issue. They campaign really hard against candidates. So we see that right now with sort of pro-choice, pro-life interest groups, is that they're campaigning hard at this moment in September of 2018 on the Brett Kavanaugh nomination. And what we'll be doing next is looking at Federalist 10. In Federalist 10, Madison talks about factions. When you're reading that, you can pretty much interchange factions for interest groups. What he means by that is groups of people that have a similar interest. He designates that factions can be big majority factions or minority factions, but the idea is people grouped together based on things that they want from government. And he cautions, just like the other framers wanted to prevent parties from becoming dominant, he wanted to prevent factions from forming. And he argues that by forming a Republican form of government, then you will be able to limit the factions. And he talks about how division of powers also does that. So be ready when you're reading that, when you're reading about the danger of factions, that you're thinking about his concern that interest groups need to be limited in some way. Okay, that is it.